Yeah, I think Mr. Dogra, and thank you for having me here, and it's a wonderful panel. And Mr. Dogra, I think has given a broad overview of where we are vis-a-vis China. Let me go a little more granular and also contextualize, why we are here, why we are actually concerned about the dragon, having penetrated so much into the economy. I think we have to look back 3 decades, when India started opening up, and also that was also the phase where the latest phase of globalization, really kicked in. When you talk about the Spanish flu, that was the one of the first phases of globalization that we saw. But that phase of globalization was very different from the current phase of globalization. Yeah, and so in this phase of globalization, when we stepped into the ring, let me remind everyone that if you compare India and China, and one of the very rough and ready indicators that one uses is per capita GDP. India's per capita GDP was actually higher than that of China's in 1991 when we stepped into the ring. And I remember, having written a lot at that time, we used to be very fond of comparing India and China. We were very much, there was a kind of a sibling rivalry. And while China, we knew was growing pretty fast, any number of people, us included, we used to say that, look, it's just a matter of time that India actually competes with China and does even better. And there are real bases for India and China, so comparing the two economies, India and China, and to see how this trajectory actually moves. But after 2000s, after China joined the WTO in 2001, if you look at every trajectory, every economic indicator, you'll find that there is a huge gap between India and China. And today, most of you would know that China's GDP is 5 times that of India's, and this is something that if you open any one of these Chinese newspapers, Global Times or China Daily, commentators there are constantly reminding us that India should be careful about China, because what happened in 1962 was different, because India and China were comparable, but today China is 5 times stronger than India. Yeah, so that's the reality that we have to contend with. Now, also the fact of this globalization, no one in India, and that is something that I'm very worried about, that no one in India really prepared the Indian economy for to really participate effectively in this process of globalization. We had this very dominant mantra, and we call it the Washington Consensus, and that was basically the argument that you just liberalize. You liberalize, you open your economy, and let the market forces do everything. Yeah? And the market forces will do wonders. The magic of the marketplace. You get the government out of the way. You reduce policy intervention as much as possible, and let the market then rule the roost, and the market will take you wherever. And of course, they were arguing that market is going to do wonders, the magic of the marketplace, as I said. Now, we got into that kind of a mindset, and as China was doing all kinds of I won't hesitate to say manipulations, right, and which we now seem to be getting wiser about this, and this was happening all along. But no one in the government really took notice of the fact that this was happening. So while we were just opening our market, barely opening our market, And in fact, even in the WTO, we were one of the first countries to give the MFN status to China. And we welcomed them. And I remember I used to be very much involved in that process at that time. We didn't actually realize what is going to happen. Yeah. And what happened, if you look at the trade numbers, and this is what I've been writing about, that if you look at the trajectory, our trade sort of trajectory from 2002-3, that was 2002, China officially joined the WTO, 2001 actually, but 2 they started functioning effectively. You find that, the trade scenario has changed absolutely, completely. But surprisingly, even when this was happening, this whole globalization, this thing of getting more and more integrated with the global economy, with the supply chains, this remained a part of our narrative. We didn't do anything about preparing our domestic enterprises. We did not pay attention to the fact that there was hollowing out going on here. China was slowly but steadily, sort of capturing our domestic space. What Mr. Dogra was mentioning, from idols to everything was being captured, and of course, critical areas of the economy. And he also mentioned about telecoms and pharmaceuticals, among others. And this was happening. So I think we need to actually recognize the kind of problems that has happened because of I would say inadequate policy framework. We need a policy framework. I think it is well recognized. Even IMF is talking about the role of the government here. And unless we get this fixed, we are not going to be able to address this problem. Occasionally, when these kinds of border tensions happen, there will be calls for boycotting Chinese goods, and then you get back to the normal once again, where you see the same kind of situation happen. But you're never going to get away from this thing of dependence on China. And I'll finish by saying 2 things here. I'm not arguing about this whole thing from a very nationalistic point of view. I'm just looking at it from a pure economics sort of a framework. Given the kind of unemployment that we have in this country, given the fact that the Indian economy has actually not been growing for the past 2-3 years, has not been growing to the extent that it should, I think it's just it's no rocket science that you need to sort of develop a manufacturing sector, not because you want to challenge the Chinese or get out of the Chinese thing. It should have been a very simple logic for anyone who's actually involved in the policy framework to actually go down that path. Yeah, but I don't think that we still have that mindset that we need the domestic industry to be given the kind of incentives that is required to come in place, and for the domestic industry to actually provide the jobs. Because at the end of the day, what we find is that we have been exporting raw materials and intermediates to China. We have been importing capital goods and all kinds of other goodies from China. And the net result is we have been giving the value addition to China. And so no wonder China today is 5 times, the economy is 5 times larger than India, because we have been extremely generous. We have actually very generously handed over all the value addition to China. I think this should be changed, and it should take policy measures, appropriate policy measures to change this situation. So I'll end at that. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Very, very rightly appreciate, sir. That we have been quite generous. Rather, good number of commentators say that we have been a doodling fool. Being a generous to a country having this kind of hostile history and this kind of expansionist policy. and sharing, the border with us. So let me go to Mr. Jay Sahai, sir. I mean, for your initial comments, initial observations about all these issues, sir.
Thank you, Shailendra, for inviting me. I think my previous speakers have given a lot of background, so I will be in the present only. My personal view is that the so-called belligerent attitude of China is a reflection of a domestic challenge which the country is facing, and I think the economy is not doing well. So the issue of boycott of China makes sense economically because you are hitting them hard. But then you have to evaluate the pros and cons of such a strategy. We get carried away that our imports from China in 2019 was 68 billion, our export was 17 billion. So in aggregate terms, definitely they will be a loser. But when you look into the perspective, China's export to India is just 2.52% of China's total export because their global export is 2.5 trillion. Our export to China is around 5.2% of my exports. So if you are looking into boycotting China and retaliation happens, we should have a plan B in place. The plan B definitely can be the countries which have a high anti-China sentiment. That can be one part of that. Plan B can be, okay, you could more focus on restricting the raw material and intermediate, what the previous speaker was saying to China. But I fail to understand, you can't have a situation where you have the cake and eat it too. You can't blame China and then you say that we are pharmacy of the world. We have the mobile revolution in the country where mobile penetration is going by 2 million per month. Who is helping that? It's China. I'm not saying I'm not very big advocate of China, but I think we need to look into that. The bottom line, why China is supplying to you is because your economy requires that and you not have competitive manufacturing. So whether you stop imports from China, whether a third country takes that import, the bottom line is how you are going to provide competitiveness to your manufacturing. Boston Consulting Group has carried out a study, and the study reveals that India is the second most competitive country in the world so far as cost within the factory is concerned. We are outpriced because of the prior factory cost or post manufacturing cost. We are not addressing those issues. Unfortunately, we have never linked our FDI policy and the tariff policy. I was talking to one of the medical diagnostic equipment manufacturer in China, and he was supplying at that point of time medical equipment worth around $300 million. And I asked him, why you are not setting up your base in India? You have such a big market. He said, why should I put my base in India? Your import tariff is just 5%. Had it been 25%, I would have definitely looked into the markets. So I think that is something which we lacked at that point of time. And today also, we are talking about increasing tariff, whether that provides a solution to that. I definitely believe that domestic industry may be provided some kind of protection. But that protection should be only for a limited purpose of attracting investment and giving scalability to that. You cannot have these kinds of high tariff in perpetuity. We have to also bear in mind that today, if I'm looking into my non-oil import, 1/5 of the imports comes from China. And if I'm looking into electric and electronics, machinery, formulations, specialty chemical, more than 50% of that comes from China. So why it's make good sense to say that we want to look into where we can replace the supply from China. I think our strategy should be based on look into what are essential imports happening for China and what are the non-essential imports which are happening from China. To start with, let us focus on non-essential imports. Look into why these are happening. I think we have not engaged with the industry. What is happening in China? Every 3 months or every 6 months, they are looking into the trends of imports, and based on the trends of import, they are calling the domestic industry why imports is increasing, what you require to manufacture the same product. We have not looked into those kinds of aspects. I think it definitely makes sense to look into alternative to China, and COVID-19 has definitely put that focus that strategic production should happen in your country. I fail to understand why we are not putting a plant for manufacturing of penicillin G in the country. There is no manufacture of penicillin G. Why not a public sector undertaking is being set up? Even if they incur a loss by 1,000 crore, if Air India can incur a loss of 44,000 crore and we can live with that, I don't mind penciling G2 manufactured in the country. Initially, they may not have the required scalability. Over a period of time, they will have the scalability. So let us not go by the emotional approach. This is a very good time, at least when we start thinking about replacing prime imports from China. But the bottom line for that is to make our manufacturing competitive. If my manufacturer who is located in Coimbatore, once he supply machine to Ludhiana, the cost of freight is much more than the machinery if you supply from Gondown to Ludhiana. How you expect manufacturer to compete? So I think we need to look at the entire ecosystem for manufacturing. It just cannot be tariff. We have to look into our cost of trade. We have to look into our high electricity tariff. We have to look into freight cost also. And we need to provide an ecosystem if you are talking about replacing China. Let us also look into that China is playing its card very smartly. When the US tariff war started, the US imposed the duty on 10%. Within 3 days' time, China adjusted its currency so as to offset around 5% disadvantage, and then they provided higher VAT refund of 3 to 4% to the industry. In India, we are talking a lot, but when it comes out to addressing the issue quickly, we are lacking that. So it makes good sense that at least we start talking about these issues, but more concrete steps needs to be taken. And I'm sure this is the right opportunity where you are in a position to attract a lot of investment, which are not happening to expand in China. They want to come out of the China. But though we are a very large country, we talk about the demographic dividend also. We have very attractive corporate rate, but still the ease of relocation is not happening to the country. If an industry comes and struggles with acquiring the land for 1.5 years, whom you are attracting? Why not even small countries like Kenya and Ethiopia? They have state-of-art industrial township where you can just come and start production. Even today, Bangladesh government manufacturer expanding in Ethiopia because they can start a factory within a week of reaching Ethiopia. Why not we are providing this? There is no dearth of land. In fact, the new estimate says that the land pool which they have that is much more than the size of Luxembourg. We have a special economic zone where a lot of the land is lying there, which has world-class facility also. So it's a very good thing that we start talking about replacing China, but much more concrete steps would be needed if we are looking into to fructify into a real situation.
Right. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. It's a wonderful thought. Let me go to Mr. Vijay Kumar. Maybe you would like to add something here, sir. Anything interesting, which you'd like to ask perhaps, or maybe add something?
Yeah, actually, not much. Actually, I wanted to ask too many questions to Mr. Dogra, but he himself asked so many questions. So, for which perhaps we don't have the answers. I'm impressed by what Mr. Ajay Sahai says, that we are talking too much. Maybe that is one of the ills of democracy. And because of that, we talk too much, and while we were talking too much, maybe they were doing too much. But from the panelists, what I understand is there is something terribly wrong. Not with the border, but with our economy. And we were not able to face that problem. As Mr. Sahai says, maybe it's still not too late. We can start now. And as Mr. Dhar was quoting the Global Times of China, just day before yesterday, the Global Times had an editorial in which they said, China is not India's enemy, and China will not become India's enemy. India's real enemy is itself. Though it comes from a Chinese newspaper, I think it's really fantastic. And they said this in the context of, which I would like the panelists also to discuss, India again asserting that we will not join the RCEP. It was in October 2019 that we refused to join them. And now this border conflict has perhaps made it more affirmed that we will not join. Does joining that or not joining make a difference? I would like the panelists to throw a light on that. That's all for the present. Thank you.
Maybe Mr. Dogra would like to touch that, sir, this aspect, sir, or should I?
I think let's have questions if it is time for that. And then I'll certainly respond to RCEP also.
Right, sir. Right, sir. Okay. Mr. Sridhar, you'd like to add something here?
No, I think there's so much of wisdom coming out from the three. There's nothing to add. Only one doubt, because this initial comments that China is 5 times our size today. That is one, and the fact that they would not like their interest to be hurt, as Vijay Kumar just read out the latest report. Now, in which case, then there has to be, this is mainly meant for Mr. Rajiv whenever he gets the chance to answer this question. So there must be, see, there is no economic purpose, as I understand from the panelists, that they want to hurt us. Then, if there is no economic purpose in hurting us or in hurting India, why is that the expansionist regime is not thinking the way their trade and industry or their economic thinking is going? So there seems to be some difference between their left and right hand. They want to be expansionist and they don't want to hurt India. Doesn't match well with each other, or doesn't even read together. So maybe this is a question for Mr. Rajiv, because this gives an overall picture of what China is thinking. Because even if you look at and understand what the 3 panelists just now said, if their intention is not to hurt India, then why did Galwan itself happen? I mean, if you really look at, you can't have economic prosperity with another nation in togetherness if your expansionist policy is hurting them indirectly. This is my question to Mr. Raj.
Okay, so we have Mr. T.R. Ostagi with us, a very, very senior and distinguished civil servant who also carries the baggage of huge credit of presenting 8 union budgets to the, to the government of India. So, Sikhar, maybe is it possible to connect with him, and maybe, Ostagi sir has a question.
Yeah.
Actually.
Is there?
Okay. Sir, I mean, welcome, sir. It's a privilege to have you, sir. Sir.
Well, Shailendra, this is actually not my area, because it is a discussion on the economic side of the policies.
Sir.
But I'm just wondering that the panelists are saying that China's GDP is 5 times our GDP. So probably we can never chase China. China is far ahead. So howsoever effort we may make, perhaps I'm not able to conceive a situation where we'll be far ahead of China, at least in the coming years, 10 years or 15 years. So in that context, I'm asking a question from the panelists, that this government is following an entirely different policy. I mean, the economic policies of this government, to me, appears to be different from the economic policies which the previous governments have been following. This government is convincing that India should be Atmanirbhar. I mean, people of India should have a reasonably good quality of life. And particularly this question becomes important in the context of COVID-19, when people have, most people do not have anything to eat. People want money. People want to live a reasonably good way of life. May not be ultra-modern way of life, because that may not be their objective, at least in the short run. So in that context, I'm asking that what is the relevance of this Atmanirbhar Bharat or Make in India scheme? Do the panelists feel that this directional approach, which is different from the approach the previous governments were following, are they adequate, or will they give us really good dividend in due course of time, so that people have opportunity to live good, reasonable quality of life, not ultra modern quality of life? So I'm just asking a question from the panelists.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Right. So thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. So maybe I will request Mr. Dogra to start with, sir, a couple of questions we have. So let's answer them before we move to round 2, where we will talk about security dimension of India and maybe the in geopolitical scenario worldwide. So yes.
Well, I think let me start with RCEP.
Right. Sir.
First, India took the decision that it took much before the pandemic started and much before the present border crisis started or LAC crisis started. The reason was that we would have been at a disadvantage over the medium and long term vis-a-vis China, which has tariff and trade advantage already with the rest of the RCEP members. So that in sum was the objection or the resistance that India had to joining RCEP in the manner that it was framed at the moment. As you know, even at the last meeting, the membership had again requested India to reconsider, which conveys two things. Number one, they think India by itself is important enough to be not a member of RCEP. And secondly, the membership minus China also recognizes that to balance China, India's membership of the organization is necessary. The related question was the 5 times economy of China. To that, my answer is, look at what has happened recently as a result of the pandemic. Companies which were top of the world, top of the line, are today filing for bankruptcy. So similarly, the same thing can happen to nation states. It has happened earlier in history. Roman Empire went down in bankruptcy. So many other countries went down in bankruptcy. Today, there is no doubt that China is close to the summit, but tomorrow it might start slipping because of its policies. And already there are some things which are obvious that by taking on the entire world or most part of the world, it is going towards a very, very confrontational, not just security policy, but also economic policy, which could hurt others. And in turn, there could be steps that they could take in self-preservation vis-a-vis China. The other thing is about the trade with China. There was a reference in one of the questions that why is it that India is resistant to trade with China or increasing trade with China? My response to that is that the present relationship between India and China in terms purely of trade is a typical colonial relationship. We are the suppliers of raw material, they are the suppliers of the finished goods. Add to that what I had already said earlier, that they are now controlling some of our critical security areas. Do we want that relationship to continue? The third is that there was some reference made also to the percentage terms of China's global imports or exports, India's global imports and exports. The question to be considered there is not the percentage, but the spread effect that it might have. For example, when India banned 59 of these apps, the message has gone around the world. Look, for your own benefit, and secondly, more importantly, that it is possible to take on China till where it should stop hurting others or interfering in others' internal affairs. And if you find and if you determine that some of its methods are inimical to your interests, ban those apps, products, or whatever. So the game that is now developing is a far more serious game of simply trade balance or imbalance. It is a game of survival, self-interest, and the expansionism is part of that game. That's a larger message, and that we must keep in mind, because expansionism is a message being conveyed to India as to who's superior and whose suzerainty must be acknowledged. India has resisted that.
Right, sir. So maybe Mr. Jay Sahai would like to add something here. Yes, sir.
I will just add that I fail to understand that when on the one hand we are treating China a non-market economy, we have not given them the market economy status. Where's the point in entering into the RCEP where China is one of the major contributor to the entire concept? Indian industry is up in arms to face the Chinese import on MFN basis. How they are going to compete with them when the tariff becomes zero? So I fail to understand the entire process, and I also fail to understand why it has taken so long to decide on this pattern. It was a foregone conclusion unless you give the market economy status to the country, unless you have something. And point is that RCEP would have simply added to the imports from China. We may not have got much on export. When we look into Chinese major imports, it's the electrical and electronics $500 billion, or export is less than 400 million, even not 0.1%. In machinery segment, their total import is $200 billion. We are exporting 170 million, 0.8%. Medical and diagnostic equipment of $100 billion, export is $80 million. So that means we are not in a position to compete. We are not in the major import profile of the country, and therefore we were not going to get anything out of that. What surprised me that why we were engaged so long to decide on this outcome. I think Mr. Rustagi has talked about the Atmanirbhar Bharat. I personally feel that it's a good concept. I think it is a positive connotation because it makes sense to develop your self-sufficiency, self-reliance in some of the strategic sector. And I always believe that when you are interpreting a word, it has to be interpreted in the context in which it is said. When Prime Minister referred to the Atmanirbhar Bharat, he was talking concept of COVID-19. And COVID-19 has given us a very good lesson that when you have to choose between reliability and efficiency, it's better to choose on the reliability. During COVID-19, we were relying more on the next door Kirana store rather than on e-commerce portal. So when Prime Minister talked about that, I think it's a very good lesson. Let us develop strategic capabilities where we are too much dependent on imports and that too on a single source. So whether we are talking about the electrical and electronics, whether we're talking about the formulation, everything has to come into that. Because how you can call yourself to be pharmacy of the world, where on all active ingredient formulation API, you are dependent on single source. Right now also, it is not that the China is the only supplier. There are a lot of suppliers in Southeast Asia and Europe who can supply these API. Of course, cost is an issue. So I think that it's a very good beginning. We are talking about these issues, but we require a roadmap for that, and we have to pursue it very aggressively if we want the result to come out of it.
Right, sir. Absolutely. Yeah, Mr. Sridhar, you wanted to say something. Yeah. Your audio, please. Your audio, please.
What I was wanting to say is, from an RCEP dimension, Australia is an important contributor. But considering the last 4 months, I'm sorry, I can't say anything beyond 4 months. In the last 4 months, things have taken a huge dip. I think maybe someone like Mr. Ajay Sahai or Mr. Rajiv Dogra can throw a light. You know, the fact that Australia's position itself in RCEP is right now so precarious. Is RCEP a real issue today? And does it have a larger context? And that's the reason why China will misunderstand us, or China may not agree with us. Or leaving aside RCEP, what we need to do is what Mr. Ajay Sahai said. Please find out, divide them into what you can do now, what you can do later. And that's the right division that Mr. Ajay Sahai laid down. So is that more important? Because, for example, likewise, for 3 years ahead on this One Belt, One Road initiative, we said no to them. That would have given a huge set of infrastructure across. Now, that also we said no to them. But OBOR, you see, is itself a less priority even for China because much has not come out of it in terms of their investments. So I don't know why this RCEP suddenly itself looks precarious, isn't it? That's the larger question.
Can I?
Yes, please, sir.
I would like to just add one.
No, I think, RCEP, Ajay has already mentioned this, that RCEP did not make any sense from day one. And I don't understand why successive governments have been so lured to join RCEP, because I think any free trade agreement, as far as I'm concerned, is a strict no for India. And let me also tell you this, that there will be others who would say that no, there are strategic, there's strategic importance of FTAs. No, FTA is an economic agreement. Let us be very clear. Strategic issues can be discussed in other forums, but in FTAs, you're lowering your tariffs and eliminating tariffs on a whole range of products. We have this experience. We had this experience of these 3 FTAs that we did with ASEAN, Japan, and Korea. What did we get? We got nothing. Yeah, and because again, we are not able to export. We do not have a manufacturing sector worth its while. So why are we getting into these FTAs without preparing? And I said it in the beginning. You can't get into this process of globalization, with no preparedness. I've been saying it, publicly, that when we tell our own children at home that if you have to compete in the outside world, you need to prepare yourself. Prepare yourself properly, and then you will be prepared for the outside world. But that logic doesn't apply, and our policymakers do not apply that to our own economy. We want to go and be part of the global economy without any preparedness. We don't want to, I will ask the panelists here or any other, the participant. You tell me one area, and I've also done some bit of negotiations in the WTO. We also used to scratch our heads. What is it that India can offer? Because all the time we are saying we can't open up agriculture. Agriculture is, we have the small, poor farmers there. Manufacturing, there are those poor, these MSMEs there. So we used to say all this in the WTO. Yeah. In services, what do you have to offer? Only possibly IT, ITES. All the other sectors, we don't have the capacity to go and offer any sector. We can't allow those foreign players to come into our economy. Yeah. So the point is that if this is the situation that we have put ourselves into, why do we talk about RCEP? RCEP, in the beginning, when this government came into power in 2015, they gave a roadmap saying that we are not going to be liberalizing too much as far as China is concerned. So we are actually very conservative in offering China market access. But as we moved on, we found that the government was being extremely generous, and we were opening our markets very generously to China. And as Ajay was mentioning, that when China was trampling on us, even with higher tariffs on the most favored nation tariffs, if you bring down tariffs to 0, you can just imagine what would be the situation, what the situation would have been. So some of us actually wrote actively against RCEP, because there were others who said, no, RCEP allows us to form this coalition, fighting China on the South China Sea and all those kinds of the strategic interests. I think we should be very clear that strategic interests have to be decided on separate forums. On economic forums, economic issues are discussed. I would also like to sort of just respond to Mr. Sridhar's question. Why is China hurting India when China has to gain from India? I think the dragon will have to be seen in a very long-term perspective. You can't actually see the dragon in short-term frames. I'll give you one example. China is, in 2015, they had a Make in China policy. It's called Make in China 2025. But if you look at the document, it says that China wants to be the world leader in the manufacturing sector by 2049. And they actually started working on it from 2015. Now, there are all kinds of economic interests that China has in this region. It has the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. You just don't know in which way they are actually trying to construct the BRI. And I'm absolutely certain, and maybe the later generations will, can judge what I'm saying today, that China would have significant interest in this region in which he's actually, opened up, this conflict with India, right through. It's actually talking about bringing a railroad through the Himalayas to Nepal, and to give Nepal an alternative exit route, because Nepal is upset with India. So I think China and China has actually tested the waters. In the past, we have had conflicts in Arunachal. We had the Doklam problem. We have had these problems all the time, but nothing stopped us from getting closer to China. We got closer to China despite the fact that we're having all these border conflicts. So why should China assume that when they have another conflict in this in the Tibet region, or Ladakh region, India is not going to come back to the normal? Of course, the situation today is that here China did not anticipate that, or maybe that, they're going to be killing so many soldiers. So the situation has got different. But I'm not sure because the ease at which we come back to the old normal, and we don't go to the new phase that we need to do something in order to counter Chinese, and I would say here that today your basic strength comes from your economic strength. The US is worried about China because of its economic strength. The military strength comes later. So China is actually consolidating itself in the economic sphere, and the rest actually follows. And unfortunately for us, there has been no strategic thinking in terms of strengthening our economy. Our economy is completely flat. We just don't know what to do about it. Even now, even in this the COVID crisis, where many of us have been arguing that the public sector, Ajay also mentioned this, the public sector should be producing, should be tasked with given the responsibility to produce APIs, and they can well do it. There has been discussion in the government how to sell the public sector units. Now, if your thinking goes in these directions, then I don't think nothing can be done about this country, because in no way any private sector is going to produce APIs. We have seen it for the past 30 years. The private sector only produces the tablets, the formulations. It was the public sector which was into the API business, and it is the public sector that all the governments have been interested in selling. So if you do that, and there have been a lot of committee reports, I don't want to take any time. There have committee reports in the past which have said that API production, the bulk drugs production, is a risky business, and but it's not easy to get private investment into the sector. But yet there is no. So I'm just giving one example, and there are lots of examples. I don't have the time to do this, but I think at this point, if we do not think strategically about the economy, I think we'll be back to square one. Atmanirbhar or no Atmanirbhar, that's a different matter. But I think the first thing is that has to be a proper industrial policy in place, which talks in terms of infrastructure, which talks in terms of an innovation system, and it talks in terms of proper incentive structure for entrepreneurs to come in and be interested in producing domestically. Otherwise, I think we are, it's back to square one.
Right. Yes, sir. Somebody want to add? Yeah. Okay. So let me go to Rajiv that
One second. Okay. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. You can hear me, sir? Yes. So let me go to Mr. Dogra. Sir, Mr. Dhar suggested that, this economic power is the one which fuels the military power of a country. And America is very worried about it. Not only America alone, in fact, even EU is struggling with their investment agreement with China. They have not been able to close it. Only a couple of weeks back, they had a teleconference through the virtual mode. And although the Xi Jinping has promised, but still there is nothing. I mean, the EU investment is certainly not too much welcome in China. So how do you look at this? Ultimately, China is today what has been invested by the West, by the liberal democracies, either America or EU or maybe even Australia. So how do you look at this change in the geo-economic matrix in the coming 10 years, in fact? Do you think that this post-COVID is actually going to be a new set of currents in the international water, which will shape up a new body, the new geodynamics, etc., which will change everything? So.
Well, I think the first thing we should stop worrying is about America. America thinks of America first and the rest last. How they handle China, when they handle China, they know best, and we will only play a marginal role in America's calculations. What we should worry about is why is it that we got left behind, as I said in the opening statement, and why is it that China moved far ahead of us? One reason is that in 70s, 72 to be exact, Nixon and Kissinger took a policy decision that Soviet Union is a big threat to America, and therefore China must be encouraged to stand up as an alternate to Soviet Union. Now, if you ask the same Nixon and Kissinger, Nixon of course is in the other world, but Kissinger, now he says that China is the biggest threat, and it is a monster that has been created. Unfortunately for us, and this is where we come in, that monster is right next to our borders, despite Mr. Trump saying that India and China are far apart, so India has no problems there. So we are facing the Chinese threat, not just economically, but politically also. The question that we must ask ourselves is that what is it that the world would find in us which would encourage us to become an equal to China in near, middle, or long-term future? That's a different issue. So do we have the same kind of strategic attractiveness to the world as China had in 70s to America and rest of the West? Or we are going to do it all alone? My guess is that someone mentioned the example of Australia and how it has become lukewarm to RCEP and China in general. My guess is that the world is changing at a very fast pace. And the principal driver in that is the present epidemic or pandemic, as you call it, because China's role has been nothing short of villainous in this entire episode. So what might happen tomorrow post-pandemic may be quite different from what was there in 2019. China undoubtedly is at the top rung, both in technology, military, as well as industrial technology, and in terms of the economic power. There's no doubt about that. But as I keep stressing, what tomorrow brings is absolutely uncertain. If its exports to the world start reducing, if companies like, for example, the rumor or news about Apple shifting its industrial base to India, or Google's report today, if these things pick speed, then changes may happen at a much faster pace than you can imagine. I agree with the previous speakers that we have some faults which we have not been able to rectify in terms of our strategic economic decision making, in terms of the facilities we offer, in terms of the clearances and so on. But despite those faults, China had much more and many more faults in 70s and 80s. I can go on in describing those. Yet it thrived and yet it attracted people because of certain reasons. China was able to wipe out our power industry for reasons that you, as observers of business and industrial practices in this country, know very well as to why our industry people found it attractive to source things from China. So there are ways of obviating the negatives that we presently have or may have, and yet go forward. And I think I'll just mention 2-3 examples in this. Our scooter industry competed very well with China. Our truck industry led by Tata has competed very well. There are many other sectors where we've done well if we are determined. So things are not as bleak as it might sound presently because of COVID and so on. But there is a path ahead, there is a future ahead, which may not be as bleak.
Right, sir. Wonderful, sir. So let me go for the concluding remarks from Mr. Sahai also, sir. So you'd like to add something here, sir?
In fact, I will say that what Mr. Dogra is saying, definitely that makes a point, and Indian entrepreneurs have shown great spirit and flexibility. We were not producing masks. Today, we are world leader in export of masks. We were not producing personal protection equipment. Now, even under the licensing regime, we are exporting 50 lakhs piece per month. The industry requires that the ban should be lifted. We were manufacturing 5,000 pieces of ventilator in March. Today, we are producing 1 lakh pieces of ventilator. So there is no dearth of entrepreneurship to do it. But I think it requires a lot of understanding between the government and the industry. There are some issues which I fail to understand why a different call is taken when you are struggling with your manufacturing. Why you are not promoting R&D? The tax deduction for R&D has been gradually brought down. What makes sense? Our R&D spending is probably one of the lowest among our competitors. We spend 0.6% of the GDP. Look at South Korea, they spend around 4.5%, Israel 5.2%. And unless you are spending in R&D, you won't be able to compete in manufacturing. I think Mr. Dogra talked about the scooter and trucks. Wherever models are constantly being improved, India has an edge over China because you have to develop a prototype, you have to develop a samples, and then India can do it very easily. The fact of the matter is that when it comes to the intellect, I think we are have a lot of intellect as compared to any citizen anywhere in the world. But then we are not providing the necessary hand holding. I was talking to one of the satellite telephone manufacturer long back when there was calamity in Uttaranchal, and we were required to import 800 pieces of satellite phone immediately on the next day. The phone came from Malaysia, and the owner of the company said that I wanted to set up the same factory in India. I struggled 2 years to set up the factory. The phone which you are purchasing from me right now for $8,000 have just costed you $1,200. So the short point I'm making is that we require a lot of hand holding. It's good that on number of parameters, we are looking into the ease of doing business, but the entire process of bringing investment to the country is not at all happy for any investor unless that is changed. And your tax policy, your land policy, your labor policy, everything has to be fall in line to make this effective.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. I will let me, yeah,
no, just one question from Mr. Dhar or Mr. Dogra. Do you feel that the political setup, because we follow different political setup, we are a vibrant democratic country, China is virtually a dictatorship country, does it also contribute a lot in taking decisions, in policy making, in increasing productivity? So is India also facing some kind of a drag on account of very vibrant kind of a democratic policy where decision-making process gets slower by design? I'm just putting a question for some response.
Yes, sir. Dogra sir will answer it. Okay, sir.
Well, democracy may be argumentative, as Professor Sen wrote a book about the issue.
Argumentative Indian.
But democracy has never retarded progress. Otherwise, America would not be where it is today. Or France or Germany may not be where they are today. We are perhaps a more chaotic democracy. And for that, we may not be leaping as much as some of the other democracies are. But democracy per se has not retarded anything. That is not built into the system. What is built into the system is people like me, the bureaucrats, who have willingly or unwittingly been responsible for the retard. What has retarded progress in real terms is our infrastructure, our health facilities, and our ability to be liberal with those who want to invest and to respond in quick, early time. So it's not democracy's fault. It is our fault that we are human.
Can I just respond, Shailendra?
Please, sir. Please, sir. Please.
No, I think, democracy has often been held as the whipping boy for our lack of success. But I think it's not about democracy, it's about political will. And I think what has been the biggest problem is the lack of political will to really put our act together. It's not about, the form of the government, but it's really about our will to change things. Because otherwise, it's astounding, as to, and I'm purposely sounding pessimistic, because I don't want to sound optimistic, because I don't think we should just look at one or two examples and say that, there are things, because the system has actually gone, there are systemic crises here today. And it's not about just exporting a few things here or being competitive in this. But the problem is that when, your entire, all the major sectors have become dysfunctional. The COVID has exposed the health problems of the health sector. For a long time, we know that the educational system is not functioning. And it doesn't produce the kind of people or the kind of manpower we need to put in the industry. Industry has been crying hoarse, saying that people are unemployable. And I know, I've been in the government for a long time, but then when I went to the university, I found that the courses that are being taught have nothing to do with the policy, the framework. So when we join policy, when people from our universities join the policy framework, they have to learn all those things, because these are not taught in the universities. So, all these things have to be fixed first. And then, of course, I would say that the physical and, and human infrastructure, that's all needs fixing. And for that, the government has to come up. The government cannot actually move out and not take its responsibility, because in this last 30 years, the one thing that we have learned is that the government wants to do everything in the private public mode. Private will be first and public will come later, and the government always takes a back seat. But we know as economists that when things are not going right, the government has to step in and then lead the private sector into this. This has been the success story of the Southeast Asian countries, East Asian, Southeast Asian countries, where a proactive government has actually led the industry to greater heights. And I think that is the model that we have to that we must see in this country. We have to urge the government to please take responsibility. At this stage, the government has to take responsibility, take the whole thing in its own hands, and then provide all the incentives and other things that are required for the entrepreneur. There's a lot of entrepreneurial talent here, but just because there is no hand-holding, there are no incentives. And in a market economy, you need the right kind of incentives. You need to see what your competitor is doing and then counter it by giving the kind of incentives. You can't fight the Chinese by just sitting back and not incentivizing your industry. You can't do that. Industry will never be successful here. Or with Southeast Asian countries, you can't never do that. So I would say that here, the big thing that lesson that we take by comparing ourselves with China, with Southeast Asian countries, East Asian countries, is the fact that you need a proactive government which will actually get everyone, into the room, and then lead us to a better future. Otherwise, if you just have a hands-off policy, you're going to face the same problem that we are facing today. Thank you.
So, anybody would like to add here, sir? Anything? I mean, a very important observation by Professor Dhar, that the government needs to actually put on the hat of an entrepreneur rather than an adventurer. So, I mean, somewhere, maybe Mr. Vijay Kumar would like to add something here.
No, I only hope the government listens to Professor Dhar, and there is somebody there to listen to. Right. Because unless I don't know who's going to do all this. We have said several things that have to be done, but as he says, the boys and girls he sends from the universities, when they join government, they don't know where they are. So even though I don't like to sound pessimistic, I hope we could reach somewhere. As Mr. Rastogi was saying, they are too far ahead of us, and maybe bureaucrats and foreign experts like Mr. Dogra will be able to tell the government how we can reach them. And of course, they are not going to stand still. But I think hope is the only word. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Sridhar, any concluding remarks? I
think Mr. Vijay Kumar correctly summed it up. But the only one thing is that I just wanted to ask the panelists that, do you think that this kind of a blow hot, blow cold with not only with China, but with China. So with China would have only with India or with all other countries, because then this would be their kind of modus operandi with all countries in the rim of Asia. Or is it going to be only India? Because then that will give us, as Vijay Kumar said, all the more urge to correct course right now and take policies to ensure that what needs to be done immediately to face China, what needs to be done further ahead to face China economically is more important than getting very emotionally taken away and then try to just shout from the podiums.
Okay, so you want Mr. Dogra to answer that?
Okay. Well, I'll answer him and also add to what Mr. Dhar has said. So, yes, you're absolutely right that we are the only country which has taken on China. Otherwise, all the other countries whose islands China has taken, whether it was Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, and so on, they kept quiet. And it was only after 15th of June that the message went around that, yes, you can assert your rights vis-a-vis China and start doing it now. Philippines, for example, yesterday, it has issued a note to China saying that you have to respect the International Arbitration Tribunal, whereby the islands are ours, not yours. For the last 5 years, it had kept quiet. So that's a beginning. Let's hope it is followed by the countries to similar or lesser or major extent. But the other thing is the point which we had been discussing over the last 10 minutes or so, that the governments or leaders and so on had not done enough for India. In fact, this is an issue which we, whether in our drawing rooms or other discussions, keep on coming back to repeatedly, that our leadership has let us down, our governments have not done enough. And this was the question I started with from foreign policy angle when I started writing my most recent book, which has been released yesterday, India's World. The foreign policy followed by 8 prime ministers. I picked 8 prime ministers. And I was amazed at the amount of work that these prime ministers had done. Of course, they had some flaws, they had some warts, they made some mistakes. But look at where we were in 1947. Which other country in the world started with a partition which led to the killing of more than 1 million people? Which other country has had 4 to 5 wars, major wars, which were devastating economically? And which other country has lived with 40 years of terrorism from Pakistan? So we've had problems galore, not to talk of our population of 1.3 plus billion and related issues with it. So we haven't done as badly as we like to think of ourselves. There are pluses. We've had, fortunately, great leaders who, as I said, made mistakes. But I think we should feel ourselves slightly blessed that we didn't have leaders of the type like General Zia of Pakistan or Idi Amin of Uganda. So let's count our blessings.
Absolutely, sir.
Can I ask one last question?
Yes, sir. Sure, sir.
Just half a minute.
Right.
And that is to Mr. Dogra.
Okay.
Sir, I would like to get an answer from you whether you agree with Mr. Dhar that it is useless for India to join the RCEP. The supplementary to that is, our joining RCEP, will it help India or China? And why is China more interested in our joining the RCEP than ourselves, than India itself? If you can.
Do you really want me to answer this question? Because you answered it yourself. So there is the answer, that the terms that were being offered were not favorable to India, and as it turns out, more favorable to rest of the other countries. You know, otherwise it was very easy sometimes to argue that if little Thailand can stand up to China and have no impact on their trade and so on, why can't India do it? But as time has proven, India was not wrong.
Thank you, sir.
Right, sir. Right, sir. So I mean, let me thank, sir. I think even Mr. Ajay Sahai has another meeting, and let me thank for this wonderful insight, sir. And very comprehensively, you have given us lots of the leaps of wisdom in terms of trade, in terms of what India should do, in terms of long-term policy, in terms of giving a boost to entrepreneurial the ecosystem in the country, and the political will overall, on top of all this, which is badly required, which is a very mandatory ingredient into making an economy as a big success and competitive enough to any large economy like China or maybe even EU or America tomorrow. Ultimately, all of us are competitors in the international market for the Indian goods. So, and I hope that this India's national security aspect, of course, as Mr. Dogra rightly suggested, that is something which must be that is something which is non-negotiable, and that must be taken care of at all costs. And we have done it. That is the reason we fought several battles in the past, in the last 72 years. So thank you, sir, for making it very, very interesting, very, very valuable, and in a wonderful session, sir. So thank you.
Congratulations for your book, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And to Mr. Rustagi also for making it very interesting. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.